I am Rabbi Q, and this is Zahara, and we are discussing today the Shabbat. The reason for this is because this is actually the first instance of Shabbat. The reason for this is because this is and that is actually from Genesis 2:1 to this particular set of verses in Exodus chapter 16. There's a huge gap of information that you don't pick up on, that where the word Shabbat is used in the Hebrew but is never mentioned explicitly in the English, and therefore you wouldn't know that the word Shabbat was present there. But I can tell you that this is the first explicit instruction about the Sabbath. Now, one of the things that we're doing here is we're really actually recapping with just a little bit more midrashic elements to it. I taught in the cycles teaching about the Sabbath and even about some of the responsibilities that we have as sons of Adam in the Sabbath commandment. And so a lot of this is kind of recap. However, this is somewhat also designed around the fact that we have new people in the congregation who may or may not have watched the cycles teaching, which we need to do. Because this is the first time that Yahweh actually uses something to mechanize the Sabbath, and that is the manna, right? The manna falls for 5 days straight, and there's no allowance of a double portion. What do I mean by that? The manna falls the same every day except the seventh day. But on the sixth day, you are allowed to gather more. Remember, what people would do is they would gather too much and it would have worms in it. They would gather not enough and it would come up to the amount they needed, right? And so it was always just the amount they needed. But on the sixth day, they would gather more because they weren't supposed to go gather on the seventh day because there was supposed to be a ceasing. But what people don't know is the powerful truth behind those commandments. Number one, and this is important, is what is implied, not explicitly stated, within the gathering of the manna. The manna was bread from heaven, specifically given to the Israelites during the wilderness season that ended when they crossed the Jordan. There is no more manna. We can be as allegorical as we want. We can be as out there as we want. But there's no more manna. And that manna was for that generation and for that season. And I can tell you, that drives people crazy. They want manna. And so they will try to force an allegory or force some mystical symbolism, missing the reason for the manna as an explicit instruction of Shabbat. And one that ceased as they crossed the Jordan. Did the Sabbath cease? No. But the instruction concerning the Sabbath was practiced throughout the wilderness season, which should be pretty significant in hindsight of the wilderness season. Okay, so in the first section of this Midrash Rabbah 2.0 for Beshalach, we discussed the idea that ceasing did not mean rest. We discussed that there was something more than just resting, but that there was supposed to be a mikra, right? And that the mikra had something to do with gathering, specifically at a fire, when it was cold, when it got cooler, when the evening began to come, which also offered a signal beacon for those who were outside the tent, who could shuv, or teshuvah, back to the tent, could return to the tent. And it was indicative that they would return to the tent and arrive and gather around the fire and discuss the conditions of the camp, discuss conditions of the things outside the camp, marauders and, a storm coming or any of that kind of stuff. Discuss what's going on, in the other clans, etc. Point being is that there was a gathering, there was a getting together. Now, I know there are people out there who just absolutely need loopholes. So you say, okay, if I cease from my W-2 position job by not working on Saturday, and then I go fishing and I talk Torah with a friend, am I violating Shabbat? Answer, no. However, if you have knowledge of other Torah observance who you could have been meeting with besides that particular friend who you're fishing with, then that becomes a problem. Because truth be told is the maximum amount of possible collective conscience participants is the commandment, the default, which means you get over your qualms, you get over your other things, right? You get over your differences in order to meet, in order to convene, which means contained within the Sabbath is peacefulness. Earlier, you had mentioned that one of the things that you try to do is do an activity that gives you peace. However, I think what you really meant was activities that satisfy you to be in a state of contentment or in a state of calmness, not peace. Because peace in a Hebrew sense is completeness. And I can tell you that in hindsight of practices that you mentioned, that is not present. Okay? So in that way, I think the next thing that we need to do is really kind of get our heads wrapped around the Mikra element, because the Mikra element plays a role in this ceasing. Because what's interesting is the ceasing is a thou shalt not, or a negative commandment that contains a negation particle, and the doing involves a active participle present tense construction in the Hebrew, but also it has a doing element, or thou shalt. So it is a holy convocation, and you shall do no work or no servile work. Thou shalt not, thou shalt. That is going to become important when we start to discuss reciprocation. So where do I get the idea that the Sabbath will take itself, or I should say that the days will enjoy their Sabbaths regardless of your choice and or practice? Jeremiah, an interesting character, but at the end of his prophecies, or I should say at the end of his purpose, it seems as though he's left to see the outcome of his judgment. He's sitting in the middle of the rubble of the entire piece. And what I mean by that is, like, Nebuchadnezzar has showed up, the general has showed up, the taking of the poor has shown, or taking of the rich has shown up, the institution of the poor into the positions of the rich has shown up, and then after that, the taking of those people because they became disobedient to Nebuchadnezzar happens, and now everything is destroyed. The temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, the entire city is in rubble, the walls are broken down, the breach has occurred, and now here's Jeremiah sitting in the rubble, and the first words out of his mouth is, "Now the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths." Now, we could appreciate the Sabbath of a land being a Shemitah, but what we do not realize is that the entire creation itself is in a state of Sabbath on the Sabbath more than any of us are. In other words, Sabbath will take itself if you do not take it. And the reason for that is because number one, our conscience, because Torah has been written upon our hearts, cannot handle not taking the Sabbath, but also the Sabbath itself as an entity or an Elohim reacts to us not taking the opportunity, and when we understand why, that gets deep. So, what about those who do not believe in God? Is there a premise that it would be wise to honor the physical laws of the universe as indicated? It's an interesting thought. For example, an evolutionist, somebody who does not believe in the Bible, believes that evolution is the reason for the existence of this current natural state of things, believes in the survival of the fittest and natural selection, right, through random circumstances. If they do not follow their rules, they are a hypocrite. And what I mean by that is that if there was an indication in nature of a rest of energy, then one could argue that even an atheist would have some form of Sabbath in their life. The reason I bring this up is because I want to reduce Sabbath down to a simple mechanism of biology and science in order to expand it back out into a metaphysical, cosmic, mystical event. So on the biological level, we have these rhythms that we go through. We have a number of them. They're called biorhythms. And they are some sort of movement of process within the brain that releases certain hormones at certain times and causes certain things to occur at certain times. The result of this is an explicit process of resting the body. There is a Sabbath every day when the sun sets by an institution of the hormone that creates a sleep state.
Melatonin.
Right. And that detection is actually not in the eyes, but in the pineal gland. And furthermore, there seems to be some sort of energy state that the body goes into as it drops into the trance-like state between sleep and awake. Now, in the Hebrew, this trance-like state in between sleep and awake, when you start to drop out of consciousness and into subconsciousness, or out of consciousness to unconsciousness, then you begin to make, when you begin to make this transition, there is a heightened amount of activity occurring in your body at that time. There is a higher resolution of cellular repair occurring everywhere than any other time during the day. That is called a circadian rhythm. Now, using a context of there being a seventh day circadian rhythm. In other words, something happens differently on the seventh day. There seems to be a higher level of cellular regeneration on that seventh day and a lower level of physical stamina or energy on that seventh day in order to utilize a higher level of cellular repair. Mm-hmm. In principle, there is a concept that there is a ceasing from a provision of energy to actually do real physical work, and you have to force it. Now, if your conscience is telling you, because the Torah has been written on your heart according to the renewed covenant, Jeremiah 31 through 34, that says, behold, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. This is the covenant I shall make with the house of Israel, skipping a verse. This is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel. I'll write the Torah upon their hearts. Then anybody who is in the new covenant is therefore then having the Torah written upon their hearts. And we believe here in After Hours Heart Ministries that went retroactive all the way back to Adam, when the light of the Passover went all the way back to Adam, which was the resurrection power of Yeshua, went all the way back to Adam, as a result of the promise that was made to Adam after his choice to convert the tree, when it says that I will make an Ezer for him. Yeshua is the ultimate Ezer of Adam. Now, in principle, and this is important, there is a concept then that even within our biological structure, there is a seventh day circadian rhythm that is different from the sixth day and different from the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth day, right? Now, we could argue that it could be epigenetic as a result of these ones who actually went out and gathered on the certain days and did not gather on the certain day, and it is actually written into our DNA. We could also argue that Torah being written upon your heart is instruction written into your DNA that instinctually would cause you to internally be willing to do the things that the rest of you actually just doesn't want to do. Let me tell you, as it stands, if you are a non-believing, non-Torah observant person, Saturday is a really good day to mow the lawn because it is one of your days off, and Sunday usually contains some sort of communal activity that we won't get into that may or may not involve jerseys or a white collar. Okay? But the premise is that Saturday's reserved for labor, right? That you can't do during the week because you're laboring, right? And so technically, this Shabbat for most is reserved for laborious activities. And so we ask a very simple question. Is that the result of the adversary actually trying to put you in a state of a positional curse to where you would instantaneously be disqualified from the blessing of Sabbath? Oh, the dangers of such an act, right? Oh, but then there's those who have started to maybe become whole Bible believers, and all of a sudden the fishing trip they planned on Saturday before they were Torah observant becomes justified because now they can actually justify not mowing the lawn on Saturday and going fishing instead. What a load of hogwash. We can learn much from our Jewish brothers and sisters, and one of the things that we can learn from them is that there is actually a practice of Shabbat. Oh, but it goes further. We can also learn that from the tabernacle construction, the things they were not allowed to do on Shabbat that were commanded to be done in the tabernacle were the commandments not to do those things. That's what's inferred. And that's what the rabbis concluded. Now, when they built the fence, they got really weird because all of a sudden you pour water on dirt, you make mud, you make a bright, you're fired, right? That's the principle. But that is not what the intensification of all power in the universe intended when he did such a wonderful thing as to cease from his works and bless and sanctify that day. Now, for those of you who do not understand the word kadosh and who think that holy means set apart, go back to your pictographs and you will not find set apart. Go back to the context of who lived around the tabernacle, and then who lived around them, and then who lived around them, and then who lived around them, and you will find a dissipation of something. I will explain further later. But suffice to say that even within the free and accepted order of the Masons, there is a belief about the tabernacle and its contents that you have yet to glean an understanding of. But suffice to say that if something was powerful enough to cause tumors and the wrong handlers of such an object, it is very possible that we're dealing with something just a little bit more mystical, just a little bit more energetic than just a box covered with gold. And I promise you that there has something to do with the idea that as you move away from that object in that holy of holies, out towards the edge of the camp, you find greater disease, you find higher ego activation, and you find polytheistic worship resulting in human sacrifice, child exploitation, and cruelty to animals, as an indication of a reduction in something that is present in the Holy of Holies that's not present outside the camp. And so, when we see, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, we think that means we are to set it apart. And I, even in this practice, sometimes foolishly forget that that's not what it means. And I will propose to you that when you have a question mark next to a pictograph set, that our lexicon is just being generous in not trying to narrow definitions to controversial subjects, because we offer us Torah observants want to offer something appealable to the people. In other words, when Jeff Benner avoids his definitions, he's not avoiding them because he doesn't know. He's avoiding them because the pictograph doesn't match the definition that seems to be present in the Bible and alters the actual culture and changes the way something is considered. Now, that is of no consequence. The lexicon is invaluable and serves its purpose. But we here at After Heart get into the controversial stuff and love to just step on toes. And one of the reasons we do is because a little toe stepping causes people to think differently. And when they do, they begin to realize that this religion that they're practicing was not designed for their benefit, but for someone else's. The code is not for the people who benefit from it. The code is to keep the people in line for the people who benefit from it. So, when we are dealing with the Sabbath, we have this holy convocation that we're supposed to adhere to, along with the ceasing. But what we need to do is make the interconnection between that commandment and what we don't realize is instruction in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. In chapter 2, verse 2, God completes or prepares his work, then ceases from his work, and then all the hosts of heaven, right? Ceases from all the hosts of heaven. Okay. I hope you're starting to see something here. But what we need to do is we need to connect the commandment to go out and gather manna to the instruction in Genesis chapter 2 to marry them together and understand something. So this is what I want to ask. What does it mean to bless and sanctify a day? What do you think? Let's start with, what does it mean to bless a day?
I suppose there could be multiple meanings, but the one that comes to mind would be more of not setting apart, but more of bringing higher of.
So elevation.
Yeah.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we elevate something?
Well, we give it importance.
Mm.
But also, one of the things that came to mind is when we talk about blessings and curses and stuff like that, and we talk about Deuteronomy where the blessings and curses are, I would think it's abundance, right? Because that's basically what the blessings boil down to, was the abundance of something. So you're giving a day abundance.
Which would make you a what?
A protector of that day?
Interesting. And you attain the responsibility of protection through?
Guardianship?
Close. Dominion.
Dominion.
So I'll remind you of how elevation works. Okay? You want to be elevated to a certain level that you are not right now. So let's set your level here. In order to get here, you cannot merit or attain to it. You could be granted it freely, but your brain, because of Adam's twisting of the tree of life into the tree of knowledge of good and evil, became a mechanism of merit. You cannot attain to this through any means by which you create that earning. And what I mean by that is that you can't create enough light within yourself to lift yourself to the next level. However, what you can do is you can take another vessel who is lesser than you, that you recognize as not your contemporary, but somebody of lesser economic status in some way. Knowledge, money, whatever. This could be any economy. Spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, financial. Okay? And you come and you get underneath and lift them up to that level by pouring out your economic status so that theirs rises. Meaning what? It's not conserved in the sense that it just is replenished on GP. Meaning you can't tell them to come up to here. You have to get down and move them up to here. A people mover is a Messiah. So this is an act of Messiah. Okay? But when you bring someone here and you've been here and you raise them, then that light elevates you to here, which is where you wanted to be in the first place. Meaning you are king here. Why? Because there are people under you. You have mastered something, because the only thing that a king has is knowledge. Okay? The rest is kind of reciprocal of that, or a symptom of that. Money is a symptom of knowledge. Okay? Rulership is a symptom of knowledge. I asked him, I said, what is it that causes you to have to protect someone? You don't know this, but it's superiority. In other words, if I fight mortal combat with somebody and I best them to the point where they're about to die at my hand, and I release them from that responsibility, they become and pay to me tribute for the cost of their lives. You want proof? Read this week's parasha in chapter 13. So the premise is, because he says right in there, I saved your firstborns, now they're all mine. Right? Because what? Because he had the authority to kill them and didn't, now they're his. That's the premise. Okay, so I best you in battle, I've defeated you. Now I have to protect you. Because you obviously can't protect yourself, or you would have bested me in battle. That's the philosophy. That's ancient Hebrew, Abrahamic philosophy. Carried over in the Bedouins, carried over in the ancient Hebrew practices that were carried over into David. You could see it in David. They were carried over into Solomon. They were carried over into Isaiah and into Jeremiah, into Ezekiel, into Elijah. They were carried over into Malachi, carried over into Yeshua, carried over into Paul, Peter, Polycarp. All practice this ancient Hebrew practice. So now the principle is now you have this lesser vessel, you are this greater vessel, you pour out by getting underneath and elevating economic status, whereby you are reciprocated upwards. So if God wanted to ultimately be reciprocated into a state of the highest of highests, or El Elyon, right? Which means the almighty or elevated one, then he would in some way have to get under and raise by his own rules. Now you say, why would he have to follow his own rules? And that is because if he breaks the rules, then he's outside of the system that he has commanded us to be within. Meaning that he can't change or break the rules in any way. Meaning that he honors the reciprocal process by first blessing the Sabbath day. Oh, but it gets even better. Not only does he bless the Sabbath day, but he sanctifies the Sabbath day. Which, if you are still stuck on holy in the English language as being piety, or worse yet, kadosh being set apart as the mechanism of that word, missing the magnitude of energy in the central position of the camp of Israel as being that beacon fire that I talked about in the Teshuvah, you understand that the gathering around the fire was indicative of a gathering around the energy that was pure and uncorrupted by the ego, which is outside the camp. Outside the camp, we are creating a false Elohim who has the power to corrupt through the Hasatan within us. Inside the camp, near the tent of meeting, we are completely within the energetic process or presence of an absolutely energized state as opposed to an ego state. Because in your higher self, you are enabled by powers or by what we call in the Greek the dunamis, the thing that flowed out of Yeshua that makes us supercharged humans to be capable of things that we're not capable of in the physical realm that we live in now, like controlling weather. Yeshua said, don't be impressed by that. Be impressed that you're in the book of life. Yeshua says, expect that. That needs to be standard. You need to think at all times that you can control the weather. Be more impressed that you made it into the list that seems so meritlessly impossible. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, bottom line is that the first thing we experience in the Shabbat is an elevation. The first thing we experience in the Shabbat is title. An interesting title, which is what? That the intensification of all power in the universe can whoop you and therefore has to protect you. Interesting, because what's one of the first things that is expected of you on the Sabbath? To cease the thing that provides for you. To stop provision. Right? To stop business and servitude. To cease from those two things. And there's another interesting thing built into that, which says, you shall do no servile work. Well, you know what? If you're in a servile work state, you are indentured, which means you owe. And here's the crazy thing about it. It's telling you to rebel against your master if he obligates you to work. To rebel against your master if he obligates you to work. But then it says, your servant shall do no servile work, nor shall your donkey. And that's where we get into something interesting, because all of a sudden, also, the animals are to enjoy a Sabbath. I wonder how an animal could enjoy the Sabbath, which would be a ceasing from their labors, in which they experience a resting of their labors, unless they had a seventh day circadian rhythm built into their bodies that would say, oh, they're giving you a day of rest. Double work on the cell regeneration. Let's move back into the first day of the week with the power to. But now we get into something interesting, because all of a sudden kadosh is inserted into this commandment. And what do we stop from on the Sabbath? Work. But what we don't realize is what work is actually talking about and what the power behind this is, because if he blessed it, that means he elevated it, like he said, blessing is elevation, and kadoshing or sanctifying is energizing. Then we understand that there is a supernatural enhancement energy put into us on the Shabbat that is not present at any other day. However, there is more. And that is that there is a reference to the idea that contained within the Sabbath is a visitation from Yahweh in that elevation. Meaning more instruction, more provision, and more protection. So by me trusting to stop working and not activate my business responsibilities on the Sabbath, I am entrusting him with them for that day. And what God can do in managing your business that you cannot should be implicitly understood. In other words, this should imply that if you cease from gathering manna on the seventh day, you won't be hungry. What a paradox. What a contradiction in process. So I've commonly or often taught people, they're like, how do you keep the Sabbath? And I'll be like, well, just don't do what you do the rest of the week. That obviously is not sufficient enough instruction. And for most people, they don't even really interpret that the way I thought that I was explaining it. In fact, if we were to incorporate something as, say, common as playing the Xbox every day, then why in the world would you play it on the Shabbat? Because that's definitely not doing something different. Okay, but I digress. All right, so the next principle that we need to get into then is the concept of if God is elevating, he's seeking elevation on a particular day as a reciprocation. But what elevates something that can't be elevated? And here's the interesting thing, what needs to be elevated in something that cannot be elevated? Because I'm going to tell you something that is contrary to every Christian belief out there, and that is that God needs credit, and that is that God needs worship, and that is that God wants your worship, and that God wants you to elevate him in status, in credit, in recognition. These are absolutely ridiculous sentiments. You say, oh, but it says praise the Lord with the harp. Sure, but you don't understand what praise is until you read about Proverbs 31, wife, and understand what praise is. Because that seems to be connected to the merited actions of the woman, which means that it is what? Conditional acknowledgement, not free credit and reputation building, but instead saying, you know what, I noticed that you actually abundantly affected my system here. I have to acknowledge that. I'll write a song about it, right? Instead of it being an understanding that the sun shines on the just and the unjust, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. You have a good crop and you thank God, you're a fool. That was promised from the beginning. You have a good crop and an abundance of a good crop, you might get a little bit wordy, right? You might say, oh, wow, that's actually something that would be a conditional acknowledgement. I acknowledge that there's actually more here than there was last year, and I didn't plant anything different, which means what? I must have somehow been adjusted in my elevation and reciprocation. Yes, that's true somewhat, but perhaps maybe you stepped into your merit. Go ahead.
So, several months ago here in Colorado, we had a really bad forest fire in the canyon. And
Turner Gulch.
Yeah. And it wiped out many acres. But there was, and we drove through it. Like a month after it happened, or something like that. And you could definitely see the scorched land and parts of the areas that were severely damaged, and crops taken out, and homes taken out, and stuff like that. But every once in a while, you would see an area where the fire had stopped and then started again.
Yeah, jumped an entire property.
It jumped an entire property, right? And I remember us commenting about how that was protection. I mean, seriously, you couldn't deny it. Like, okay, why did it just stop? And then over here it started back again, and all this is scorched. And while you were speaking, I thought of that, and I was like, okay, but that would be praise. That would be a reason I see something different than what should have occurred, and that would be praise. That would be giving praise to
A
others.
conditional acknowledgement.
And conditional
Noticing
acknowledgement,
something out of the ordinary.
right? Noticing that something different should have occurred. All these other homes got destroyed. Mine didn't. All these other homes had darkness. Mine didn't. All these other homes experienced famine. Mine didn't. All these other businesses experienced loss or, decrease in value or whatever. And mine didn't. That would be a reason for acknowledgement. Expecting, seeing that an outcome should have happened and didn't happen. For sure, I think. If you guys have other ways or reasons of
Yeah.
praising
No, I like it.
the Lord.
I like it. There's a lot that can be said about this because immediately people are going to go, "Oh, well, they must have been some righteous people." What if there were people who didn't even practice Christianity on that property? See, the thought process is missed. Now, a reductionist will say, "Oh, random ember jumped the property through the wind and went to the next property." Or the fire went around the property because it was well watered, or whatever the reasons were that it skipped that property. But what more needs to be understood here is that if you are the one with the property that survives, you're going to do more than just say, "Well, fire skipped me." No, you won't. You will actually in some way say, "Why did I get skipped?" It is just a human function. And people who don't have hardened hearts. And that's just how it is. Now, you may argue and say, "Oh, I don't think that's true." But deep down in your heart, every time that I have said something about a hardened heart and you have challenged me on a hardened heart, it's because your heart is hardened. Okay, so in principle, what we need to then get at is the mechanism of elevation through reciprocation, but how do you offer something, or how does something get to the intensification of all power in the universe who can't be elevated any further? Now we get into the concept of "unto the least of these you have done unto me," which is interesting because now we have another element here where it seems like we are supposed to bring lower economic status people up to an equal level. Well, what is the equal level on Shabbat? What are you supposed to be doing on Shabbat? We always focus on what we're not supposed to be doing and then create a justification for what we are doing. But the truth is there's a specific instruction for what you're supposed to be doing, positive commandment on Shabbat, and that is the Mikra. Now, there's a couple ways we can get into this, but the short version is that there's a gathering at the fire and a discussion about the camp itself, right? But what's interesting is on the Shabbat, what seems to be present by Acts chapter 15, verse 21, is that there would be some sort of expansion upon the oracles of God within the parasha itself, like we're doing right now. We're discussing the Torah on the Sabbath in a holy convocation of 5 people in the audience right now, in the live. Now, for those of you who are watching it later on, that's probably a higher number, because a number of you take advantage of the DVR and watch it later on. But one specific thing that we need to get into here is the elevation. because we think that he blessed and sanctified it meant that we received some sort of holiness, or actually, I'm sorry, we need to offer some sort of holiness to the Sabbath. But yet Yeshua says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So why are we offering something to the Sabbath? Why are we praising the Sabbath? Why did he bless and sanctify the Sabbath if it was made for us? Because what he can do with what we don't do that day is more powerful than what we can do if we had done it that day. Mind blown. Because now all of a sudden, what would happen, say, if we were to not go fishing on the Sabbath and go fishing on Thursday? What presumably would happen? A bigger catch, right? Presumably. Greater enjoyment, presumably. Enabling, presumably, right? Let's say that we just go with a normal W-2 burger flipping person. They cease from flipping burgers on Shabbat. What is going to happen to their burger flipping on those other days? And what I mean by that is on Shabbat, God's flipping the burgers for you. So what happens to the franchise if that employee is actually given that day off? What happens to the manager if they actually take the day off? Who's managing McDonald's on Shabbat if everybody took the day off? Why? Because of the reciprocation, which I'm going to explain in a minute. In other words, this is actually the imputation of Yeshua. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. In that state, we are meritless. We attain the light through the gift of the light, not through the earning of the light. The earning of the light is through the elevation, through humility. So we contract in order to expand someone else, in order to have an expansion. That's the principle. Okay? Yahweh first did that on the first Shabbat so that he would be elevated above all other things. He got under all of creation, blessed it and sanctified it, and raised it to the economic status that he was, adding in the concealments in order to protect the lesserness of the lesser. In principle, what happens then is that the rest of the week we are given his responsibilities that he was actually supposed to do on Shabbat, so that he will take our responsibilities that we're supposed to do on Shabbat and rest from. Meaning what? Our malakah, or agency, which we've discovered during the cycles teaching, was to actually operate as Elohim in a state of dominion 6 days out of the week. But in the seventh, we're supposed to rest from it. And we are supposed to operate in a state of service by elevating those who cannot elevate themselves in those 6 days, whereby we are overcoming the ego to gather too much manna and overcoming the ego to not gather enough manna those first 5 days. And on the 6th day, we're overcoming the ego to not spend that extra intention to gather more manna, because tomorrow there will be none. But what we don't realize is what's elevated on the 7th day is actually imputed. And what do I mean by that? I mean that Yahweh ceases from his works. Let's put that at this level. We have a tendency to want to not cease. So what's supposed to happen? We are supposed to cease and he is supposed to work. Okay? But what he doesn't do is he doesn't work. And the reason he doesn't is because he's looking for us to elevate. Where does that happen? Through a crisscross reciprocation. For every moment we take during the week to elevate, we then are elevated. And for every moment that we cease from elevation, we are then elevated. Meaning, and this is important, if you rest on the Sabbath, he will do the work because he rested that first day. If you work the 6 days, he will rest and allow you and enable you to do what he's doing on the Shabbat, whereby you have a more powerful week, a more enabled week. You have the ability to remember the Sabbath day. That's why it says, for 6 days you shall work. That's a Sabbath commandment. For 6 days you shall work, and the seventh you shall rest? No, you shall cease from that work. It is not your day to go recreate. And furthermore, there seems to be an intention that the only way in which you are actually able to receive the energy that sanctified that day, in which he provided a huge burst of energy. That's what sanctification is, not what you've been taught in Sunday school. That huge burst of energy that defies the ego and enables the higher self to do what Elohim do now makes sense. In other words, on Shabbat, you are made out to be equal with God. And that equality is a result of his elevation of the day, right? And then the imputation into your week by you ceasing. So what's going on? Quite literally, this is how it goes. I'm the business owner, and I do business those 6 days out of the week. On the 7th, Yahweh rested from his malakah, which is an agentic behavior, meaning he's an agent of someone. But what he was doing was imputing that agency to us so that we could instruct him on what we want done by ceasing from it on the 7th day. In other words, what you want taken care of during the week is nothing compared to what he's going to do on the Shabbat, while you are resting from it and trusting him with it. And furthermore, what you receive during the Shabbat is what he was supposed to receive as a result of getting underneath us, even to the death. And that resurrection power elevates, 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 elevates. Now, here's the part that's important. If that be true, what damage are you doing to yourself and your week by not properly ceasing? Now, if you're a non-believer, this is a difficult thing, right? If you do not believe or have a reflexive relationship with God, I'll explain reflexive in a second. If you do not have a reflexive relationship, then in principle you will not understand this, and that's okay. Because at least you need to understand is that within creation is a special circadian rhythm for the seventh day after 6 days of labor. Now, that could activate on a different day than the Sabbath, but the manna gave us the instruction for what day that would be. That Christianity, while under the power of the Holy Roman Empire, decided was the seventh day. That Cardinal Regalio at the Council of Trent in the 1500s with Martin Luther accused Luther of being in violation of under his doctrine of sola scriptura, which said that only the Bible can interpret the Bible, meaning only the Sabbath could be kept on the seventh day. And Cardinal Regalio said that was proof that he was a heretic, that he violated his own doctrine. And guess what? The Council of Trent did not end well. The Council of Trent did not recognize the authority of Luther's doctrines, thereby not only perpetuating the problem of the Holy See and the Vicar of Christ and the inappropriate constructs of hell and demons and Satan as being a motivator for absolution, which can guarantee you a place in heaven that is not scripturally sound either. But that is the mechanism of Protestant Christianity to this day. Now, within that, we arrive at a concept. If you violate the Sabbath, the opposite of all I just told you is true. So you go through your week, boink, 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 boink. You arrive at the seventh day and you don't rest and you do something other than what is instructed to do, or worse, you do something that you're not supposed to do, then guess what? Your next week will be a deficit of all the things I just spoke of. The supernatural empowerment energy, the collective conscious connection to your soul, and the abundance and blessing that was taken from the Sabbath and imputed upon the 6 days shall you work. I want you to think about something. When Torah discusses something, the first thing it mentions in the list is the highest priority. So the 6 days are a commandment of Sabbath, and they supersede the commandment of ceasing. Mind blown again.
So is that the cutting off? Like you're cut off from the energies, you're cut off from the production, you're cut off. What was the other one?
The corporate collective conscience?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the cutting off of the people.
Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, that sounds pretty accurate. Meaning what? You will be treated as one outside the camp. Who is what? In their ego. They're completely disconnected from the supernatural energy and wisdom and power of the pure stuff coming out of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, let's talk a little bit about some scenarios that could be loopholes to the discussion. Let's say that you and a friend are the only ones in your circle of influence who are Torah observant. And you both agree that you want to meet and therefore convene about Torah. Does the context of how you do that matter? In other words, what you do to do that matter? Let's say you want to go to the coffee shop. What do you say?
Well, instead of, besides making everybody else work.
Probably... You said something that a lot of Torah observant people say that is very Torah terrorist related. What I mean by that? The people who have the nerve to say that someone else works because you give them commerce do not understand the point behind you giving them commerce. What do I mean by that? They're going to work regardless of what you do. You are not increasing or decreasing that as a single individual. Now, if you're the owner of the company, I would highly advise you to institute the Sabbath into your company, and I can almost guarantee you that you will have the same prosperity that Chick-fil-A did in saying that we're just not going to work on Sunday. And I propose to you that the Chick-fil-A lawsuits and the Chick-fil-A abundance that it is experiencing, starting out as some mall fast food in some mall, is the result of the concealment behind the rest. In other words, they cease from a day, therefore all the circadian rhythm stuff that I was talking about comes into play. All of the pieces of the puzzle concerning rest and all of those things I talked about with the body come into play, but they're still operating in the anti-Semitic sentiment that Saturday is not the day of rest, and operating within the Edict of Milan within the confines of the pagan king and his pagan practices by which Christians were given rights, which is all citizens of Rome under the Roman Empire, regardless of their religion, shall cease and be idle except for those in the agricultural businesses. That's the Edict of Milan on the venerated day of the sun, 321 AD. And so even within that, we can see the anti-Semitism that then carries over into Constantine's letter in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, in which the Passover is cut and Easter, a pagan practice, is inserted. Go ask your pastor why you have Easter egg hunts on Easter Sunday, and how they pertain to Christ. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do then is understand that reciprocation goes both ways, but I want to talk about the reflexive concept within the Hebraic knowledge or the Hebraic culture. And that is that when you are in operation in a contemporary state, there is a reflexiveness. In the Hebrew culture, friends value what friends value. In other words, if a person calls somebody a friend, which you'll see in a number of places, Abraham calls Honor, Eshcol, and Mamre friends, right? And we know in another place it said he was in covenant with them. Now, if friends value what friends value, then we can acknowledge and understand that if there is something that I find disturbing with you that I don't find valuable, there's a problem with our friendship. So if you do a practice that is unacceptable to me, then we're not really friends, because I can never value that. So what's interesting is friends valuing what friends value causes them to be equal in philosophical agreement. Furthermore, friends valuing what friends valuing is equal in ethical agreement. And friends valuing what friends valuing is equal in sharing the abundance of the other. So when we say that we believe that we are made equal with God on the Sabbath, well, first we're following our Messiah, who got what? Threatened to be killed and to be stoned because he made himself equal with God. But we're laughing in the face of the scribes who created the emendations in Vayera, who altered the Torah, maintaining the equidistant numbering system, but altered the Torah to reflect that Abraham was not equal with God because they didn't like how Abraham was talking to God or how God was talking to Abraham. But within the equality is the elevation. When he blessed the Sabbath, he brought us up to that level on the Sabbath. If we acknowledge and accept that, then there is no need to elevate the other. Now there's a contemporaneous exchange Of what? And we're talking about the intensification of all power in the universe here. So you go ahead and you give him some information, that's fine. But what he's going to give you back is going to knock you on your feet. I mean, on your butt. So you're going to say, hey, did you know the duck-billed platypus, blah, blah, blah? And he's going to say, yep. And did you know that the cross section of Neptune contains this, and this? Right? He's going to give you deeper knowledge. So here's the crazy thing. What can you do to enhance that deeper knowledge? You say, well, I suppose I could open myself further to it. Yes, that's true, but I'm going to propose to you that some of that needs to come through a connection to your subconscious, which is what, oh, you got a big old grin over here. Go ahead.
No.
Let's hear it.
Mm-mm.
No?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So in principle, then you need to connect in with what's known as the Na'um. The Na'um is the deeper trance state in between sleep and awake, or in a state of meditation, while you are opening yourself to the supernatural and spiritual energies and guidance available to you from the Shabbat. Which means that we will meditate sometime during the Sabbath. Although you could group meditate, that's not what Mikra means. Mikra means a crying out in a group, or a teaching or a reading out loud in a group. And the pattern that we look at for Ezra is that he broke the parasha up into a daily reading during the week until the 6th day, and on the 7th day was the actual teaching or expansion about what was read that week. In fact, in most Humashes you can find that there's actually an Aleph, a Beit, Gimel, a Dalet, a Hey, all indicating, and evolve, to all indicate what day of that portion is actually to be read. Then on the 7th day, the gates to the city were closed so that the merchants could not come into the marketplace, but the people could gather in this square, which was the marketplace, and learn from Ezra something profound about those portions. And those portions were read throughout the week in the marketplace while the merchants were present. And what was the reason why the merchants could not come into Jerusalem? Was it because of buying and selling?
No, it was because of carrying burden.
It was because they carried their burden. They carried their store into the marketplace and set up. Meaning what? Meaning that he was giving instruction to the Gentiles, because there's no self-respecting Jew that was going to set up their merchandise on the Saturday. He was giving instruction to the Gentiles about Shabbat by closing the gate, which Hitler complained was an idleness, which the Council of Laodicea implied was an idleness. But they don't accept is that at the same time they were gathering in the square in a synagogue, which was what? A common gathering place. They were participating in the eating of the things that proceed out of the mouth of God. Man shall not live on bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Thereby blessing all of their endeavors, those 6 days that are commanded as the first part of the commandment of the Shabbat. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, for in 6 days you shall work. That is the first part of that commandment, and is lost when we go into a Shabbat wanting to mow the lawn or go fishing or play the Xbox. He's asleep.
No.
And so, in principle, what then have we gleaned from this week's parasha? We've gleaned that when he created this mechanism And I will propose to you that there's a detail missed that I'm going to remind you of here. We remember when we were in Egypt, we would have rather died in Egypt next to the what? Flesh pots where we had bread in abundance. Now, that's not like any slavery I ever heard of, but I won't get into that. Eating not by the flesh pots, eating bread in abundance, manna does not contain flesh, which means meat needed to be a part of the promise as well. And meat needed to become the process by which all of the question was answered. But contained in that was the context of a promise. As they left the Red Sea, they arrived at the 7 Palms, which was an oasis. Did they complain there? No. They moved from the 7 Palms to another place that was not an oasis and had bitter waters. Did they complain there? Yes, they did. Did Moses do something about it? Yes, he did. Did he leave them in bitterness? No. Did he leave them in bindings? No. Did he leave them in Bamidbar, in the wilderness? No. Did he leave them in the wilderness of Sin, or of Zin, or Aref Daim? No. But he definitely brought them something to answer the bread in abundance, and that was the commandment of Shabbat. See, y'all think it was the manna. People get so caught up on the manna because, why? Some great supernatural wonderful thing fell from heaven. Well, you know what? Let me tell you something. That should have told you something about your provision. That should have told you something about how you think about the state that you're in. You know, I look back on just this previous year of the times when we were in what we perceived to be a state of scarcity. And yet here we are, still in our home, still have a refrigerator full of food, still have options to more than survive, but thrive. And yet at the time of the scarcity, we were in such fear that you would be hard-pressed to convince me that we would have continued here. And truth be told is that doesn't do me any good. I still deviate from this thinking and encounter that scarcity. So it's not like knowing this makes it any easier. You still have to overcome those things. But what I'm trying to help you understand is the value of Sabbath, not within the rest itself. That is a mistake. That is a misunderstanding of that Hebrew word. Not a mistake within your body, because your body does contain a very specific 7th day circadian rhythm different from the other 6. And your body contains a specific circadian rhythm within a 24-hour period that is completely dedicated to your rejuvenation. But I promise you, if a good percentage of your effort is driving to the lake, you will have a non-abundant and possibly scarcity-related week. And then I'll add another element that you will also, at some point, have the Sabbath take itself, which will come in the form of sickness, will come in the form of lethargy, will come in anything to get you to stop and take those moments in which you were supposed to have a rejuvenation. But the huge rejuvenation of your soul has nothing to do with the resting, but instead has to do with the connection and the engagement with the intensification of all power in the universe through not only a mikra, but a connection to the ne'um, which requires you to get in some sort of meditative state. The closest that you can come to that is the place in between asleep and awake, which is going to occur as you're falling asleep and as you are waking up, at which point you ask the questions. Somebody asked me today, did it mean that the Sabbath was the best time to pray for something that you wanted? I will propose to you that if you're stuck on what you want during Shabbat, then that means that you must have had wantonness during the week. And I will propose to you that what is really should be sought on Shabbat is to open yourself to the equality and the oneness and the reflexiveness of your connection with the divine. And I propose to you that is only in a result of meditation, which should occur after the Holy Convocation in order to invoke thought. In other words, you have the Holy Convocation in order to make you think differently about the Torah portion, which you heard all throughout the week, which you should have been reading all throughout the week, each day individually a section, and that particular information would then turn into an insight on Shabbat that then you could open yourself to the information of during the Ne'um. And that is what I find to be the full commandment of Shabbat. So what are you actually opening yourself up to when you are doing this? Like I said, number one is obviously you have that interaction of instruction, but you're also opening yourself up to provision and protection, which intriguingly enough could become an intuition during the next week. What I mean by that is I have had some really crazy stuff happen that would really blow your mind because it seems like God is violating his own Sabbath. I would drop into the Ne'um and have business instruction that I did not understand before become available. Now, my caution has been to not put it into any type of practice until after the Shabbat. But the premise is that I've even had instruction about how to better run my business on Shabbat while I was in the Ne'um. Meaning what? Provision. It doesn't always have to be this profound revelation about, some deep mystical concept. It can be as simple as, you know what, when you wake up tomorrow, why don't you go fishing? Instead of doing this thing over here. And all of a sudden, you go fishing, you meet a person, they might have some sort of business partnership for you, blah, blah, blah. I don't know how many times I've been instructed to do something on the Shabbat, carried it out during the week, and it ended up being an abundance. An abundance of relationship, partnership, connection, etc. So as we close this second session, I want you guys to think about what implications have come from what we just learned. Okay? And we will continue with the next session after a break, and then the Sabbath will probably be over by then. So for those of you who are not going to be present for the third session, Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who are going to be present, we'll see you in a while. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.